The majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
That can't be the gospel, because God said to love our neighbors.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
Matthew was specifically written to a Hebrew Jewish audience, so there's going to be a lot more of that element in there. Mark was the Greek, Luke was the Greeks, Mark was the Romans. John, we're not really sure. He just wrote it to everybody, I think. But there's different focuses and angles each one is going to take. So Matthew is going to be more of a Hebrew audience, first century Hebrew audience in the ancient Near East. So lots of stuff going on there. And there's a lot of history that they're just going to understand because it's the world they're living in, the water they're swimming in. So just a quick background on how we got here. There's Mr. Herod. I just want to show you a picture of Mr. Herod up there. That's actual photograph. I think it was Polaroid. I'm not sure, because he was that old that they did Polaroids back then. Now, a quick history synopsis of the people of God and the history as they tell us about it is they were in Egypt under slavery. Moses kind of led them out to the promised land. They established their own monarchy line with a man named Saul. Wasn't a very good king. He got canceled. And so they put in King David instead. King David was a fairly good king, made some mistakes, but he was very famous for killing Goliath with a rock, if you remember that story, David and Goliath. So he was kind of like their hero, their very first king that they was like they call it the line of David. So he was like the guy, kind of like George Washington is to American history buffs. Like he's like, wow, the founder, president person. Like that's the thing in your mind. Like you get that thought of George Washington is like, oh, yeah, you know, all the nostalgia, all the history, all that. That's what King David was to them, because it's kind of like he's the first like God appointed one that we really like. He was good. His son Solomon took over, wasn't that great. He caused a civil war and the nation divided into two, north and south. And so then they had their own kings. The books of Kings and Chronicles kind of show us that they go for a couple hundred years that way, going through good kings and bad kings, mostly bad kings. They were pretty rough. And then this country named Assyria comes in from the north and obliterates Israel, the land of the north, and just totally obliterates them. It was around 722 BC. They're gone. It took everyone, sold them off into slavery. And there was a small sect of people that tried to hold on to their Hebrew roots. They later became known as the Samaritans. So if you have any Bible knowledge of some stories about a good Samaritan or whatever, that's where they came from. And then to the south, the Judah, the land of Judah, they held on for about 150-ish so more years. At 586, then this country named Babylon comes through, and they totally wipe out the town, destroy the temple that was their beloved center of culture, economy, politics, religion, everything. Destroyed it, leveled it to the ground, and sold everyone off into slavery. So it was a big, huge deal. Then we have something called the intertestamental period. What happens between the close of the Old Testament with the prophet Malachi and the opening of the New Testament with the book of Matthew. There's something called the intertestamental period. Some people say it was a quiet period where God didn't talk very much or do much. But I think the book of Maccabees would like to have a word, because we have Hanukkah, because a whole lot of stuff did happen in that period. The Greeks came down and they utterly destroyed the Persians who were overseeing the Hebrew people. And so now they're in charge, and they don't like the Hebrew people, so they're persecuting them, killing them. The king actually went into this temple that they rebuilt, and he slaughtered a pig right on the Holy of Holies. Like you can't get much nastier and dirtier than this. And so the people rebel. They do this guerrilla warfare type stuff against the Greeks, like Spartan Greeks. And they actually drive them out of Jerusalem. They gain their own independence, and then they put another king on the throne. And this was from not the David line, but from the Hasmonean line. So that's all nerdy, important history to this story, because this is where it picks up. These Hasmoneans then conquered a group of people to the north called the Idumeans. They were Edomites, if you have any Old Testament knowledge in your brain. And so they conquered them, and they forced them to become Jewish. Forced conversions happened. under the Hasmonean kings in Israel. So then Rome comes to town and they're like, well, we're annexing you into the big old empire of Rome. And you really can't fight Rome. They're the largest superpower on earth with the greatest military, the most high-tech stuff. And so they're like, what are we going to do? Like say no and die? So they say yes. And there wasn't a lot of bloodshed about it, but they weren't happy about it. So now Rome is in charge of the Hebrew people. And there's kind of like, they take the Hasmonean kings. They're like, you can stay there. You just have to pay us taxes and introduce our culture to your people. And so if you know anything about Jewish people, they're really hanging on to their identity and their culture and their heritage and their traditions. And they're not going to let them go and just invite Roman stuff into their temple and their things. So there's a lot of divisive talk about how do we live as the people of God under this Roman oppressive governmental system. That's the whole world at the time when Jesus was born. Now, Herod the Great, he was the king of the Jews at the time. Now, he still has to pay tribute to Rome and pay taxes. He's not totally in charge and all this other stuff. But Herod was the son of a Jewish aristocrat who was forcibly converted during that civil time when the Hasmoneans took over the Idumean people. So he's an Edomite. He's not Jewish ethnically. So the people don't really like Herod. But he had these strong connections to Julius Caesar. Maybe you recognize that name. But he was the son of this convert aristocrat, highfalutin person who had lots of ties to high up people in Rome. And so Rome approved Herod as governor of Galilee in 47 BC when he was in his mid-20s. They're like, you can go ahead and rule that. Now, as the governor of Galilee, he was really ruthless. He executed anyone who rebelled against him. He didn't give them any kind of Roman due process or anything. He was just like, no, don't like you, you're dead. He just kills people. So that the Hebrew rulers of Judea, the Hasmoneans, are still there. They don't like Herod, so they actually drag his butt into court and they try him for murder. And they're putting him on there, but he narrowly escaped the trial. And now he's totally ticked off at the Hasmonean kings. He's like, I'm gonna like politically assassinate these people. So he's planning violent retaliation and assassination of the Hasmonean kings so he can establish himself as the king. This is what Herod the Great's doing. This is all before Jesus. This is like in that 40 BC area. And so he's planning this violent retaliation, but his family is like, hold it back, bro. Like, don't do it. You're going to get into a lot of trouble. Like, just ease off the gas pedal for a little bit. So he's like, all right, I won't, kill the Hasmonean kings. But then a whole civil war erupted. A king was installed that Herod did not like, totally disapproved of. So he went to Rome. He's going to complain because he's got connections in Rome all the way to the top dog. And he goes over there and he's looking for advice. He's like, I don't like this king. I'm just the governor. I don't like this king. I think this and this and this and this and this. And the Caesar was like, you know what? You're right. You're the king now. It just boom, like that. He just said, you're the king now. Caesar looked at Herod and said, you're king. Take these legions, go back, conquer those people, put them under, subdue them, and then just, continue to keep the taxes rolling to Rome because that's really your job. So he went back with his Roman army to overthrow that installed king, and he won after 3 years of war. Took a long time. And he ended up, when he won, he's got to try and win over the affections of the Jewish people who live in Jerusalem area because he's not Hebrew, he's not Jewish, and now he's their king. How's he gonna, they're like, no, King David, the line of David, this is all important to us. And he's like, yep, I'm your king. Caesar told you I'm your king, so you're just gonna have to deal with it. Well, he ended up banishing his son Doris or his wife Doris and his son so that he can strategically take a new wife who was a little bit more Jewish to have this alliance with the Jews. And then he executed the seated king, declares himself king. And that's how he became the king of the Jews, Herod the Great. Now, Herod's throne was threatened multiple times. He was really ruthless, but he maintained control through ruthless assassinations. just knocking people off left and right. He was known for killing people. The Jewish people didn't like him very much because he wasn't ethnically Jewish, and he was just appointed king by Rome, and they didn't like that. And he suppressed the people's contempt for him through the use of a secret police force. He actually hired a whole bunch of people, embedded them in all areas of society. And he says, report back to me who's dissenting, report back to me what the sentiment of the people is. And he would then go and assassinate the dissenters. And then he would monitor the opinions of the people so that he knew how to publicly talk in front of them to sway their opinions towards him. He prohibited all protests and demonstrations. He had all opponents removed by force, legally or violently through assassinations. And then he took on humongous building projects. This is what got him the nickname Herod the Great, because he took on the biggest building projects in the world at the time. He increased the footprint of the Jewish temple by twice its size. He built cities, both Jewish and non-Jewish cities. He expanded infrastructure, and he did this through lots of taxes and all of his influence with the Romans. And so he did all of this stuff. But one thing that he did that the people hated was he took a Roman political symbol, a golden eagle, and he put it right at the entrance to the temple. And if you're a Jewish person, you're just one step removed from bringing it inside. And they did not like that at all. They said he's probably got Rome's welfare in mind more than ours. And so they didn't like him. But Herod had this constant concern for his own reputation. And so he would make all of these lavish, expensive gifts to foreign dignitaries that would bankrupt the country. And then he'd increase the taxes so he can get more money to build more infrastructure and buildings and all this other stuff. And then make these huge gifts and like make friends with all these people around the world. And so this is what got him the nickname Herod the Great, because he built all of this stuff. I mean, he was just building projects all over the place. He was Rome's masterpiece for the area, but Judea's nightmare. He was installed as king, not by his people, but by an imperial decree of people who didn't even live there. And Herod ruled through both brilliance and brutality in equal measures. And the temple at the time that he rebuilt was the largest worship temple in the world when he increased its footprint by 2 times. He was an architectural genius, but his insecurity was humongous. Just could not trust anyone. He trusted nobody, not his wives, not his sons, not his family, not his subjects. And as age tightened its grip on him, fear became his policy, and he executed members of his own family to protect his own throne so that nobody could ever challenge it. So when kings in this story come from the east bearing gifts for the newborn king, how does that backstory influence the story of the 3 wise men? Like, what do you think Herod's going to feel when he's like, what do you mean a king? Like, no, I'm the king. And now these kings from the east, this is somebody that he would normally make a large gift to earn their favor. They're coming with gifts for this person born king of the Jews. They've come to pay homage to this new king in the line of David. This is going to be the people's king and not the one appointed to them by the Roman Caesar. So Herod responded, just as tyrants always do, not with like, let me think about this. Let's look into this, but with violence. This whole story picks up here. The 3 wise men just left to go worship the king. Herod's trying to figure out where this guy, this newborn king, is supposed to be born. He's asked the wise men. That's where our story picks up. Now you know Herod's personality and his insecurity and his use of violence to secure his own power. That's who Herod was, and that's where our story picks up. So Herod ordered the slaughter of Bethlehem's children, certain age and under, not because they were powerful, but because they were vulnerable, and because this little baby was threatening his throne and his power. And so in this story, they hear that Herod is after Jesus to kill him, and so God becomes a refugee in this moment. Salvation is threatened, and the light of the world goes on the run from the empire power that wishes to destroy it. And this is where our story picks up. This narrative here, it says, after they left, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, hey, get up, take the child and his mother and go to Egypt and remain there until I tell you so, because, Herod's about to search for him and kill him. So what's happening, remember, the book of Matthew is written to a Hebrew Jewish audience, and there is an alignment happening here with narrative elements that we might miss. So do we know anyone else in their history that fled an empire out to kill him, who dodged the slaughter of many innocent children, who was then called out of Egypt to then take the people of God where they needed to go? Anybody? Maybe starts with, rhymes with Oses. So what's happening in the narrative is Matthew is aligning Jesus as another Moses figure. And what's happening is Jesus is being framed as Moses, and his flight is one of innocence, while Moses actually murdered a man and ran off. So there was a little bit of guilt on his hands. But Jesus is just an innocent child. So there's an alignment with Moses and then a greater than Moses that's happening here. And Herod is actually being framed as a pharaoh, as a king of a powerful empire that's in opposition to God's kingdom of justice and mercy. And so this whole framing is happening here. And this passage here, actually, there's no other historian captures this moment in Harry's life. Josephus doesn't capture it. None of the, Pliny, the elder, none of the historians of this time capture this moment except Matthew. He's the only one that does. And so what he's doing is he's trying to reframe Herod and reframe Jesus in narrative form by aligning them and saying, remember that story? It's happening again. It's happening again. And so this icon here is kind of taking that Moses in the basket on the Nile River, floating away, being in safety. It's kind of like this kind of blends the two things together. I like it. Now, I don't know if you have trouble with technology like I do, but I can't seem to get technology to work when I really need it to. And then every now and then it's working and it's cool. But most of the time I'm fighting with technology. We just got these new thermostats and we're still fighting with how do we adjust them, and we're going to fine tune them. And this is like, nightmare sometimes. But if you call technical support, what is the number one thing that they're supposed to tell you? Have you tried turning it off and back on again? You've heard that, right? Like, have you tried turning it off and back on again? You've heard it so much that that's the first thing you do before you call anyone. And then you're like, yes, I've tried to do that already. It didn't work, right? That's why I'm calling you, because I already did that. This story is kind of like the people of God have kind of wandered off and they've gotten off the path of what God's plans was. And now we're going to hit reset on the story. We're going to call them out of Egypt again, but we're going to live the whole life of the people of God through this one person named Jesus. So it's almost like God saying, let me turn that back off and turn it back on again and see if that works in the person of Jesus. It's kind of like that going on. God's revelation comes in this passage, not through all of the earthly power structures so precious to Herod, right? There's no this message from God comes from an angel in a dream to Joseph. That doesn't mean he's like super spiritual and like a monk-like Jedi character that just like walks around barely touching the ground because he's so holy and God speaks to him in dreams. And boy, if I could just be holy enough for God to speak to me in dreams, that'd be cool. That's not the point of this story. The point of the story is about how God is bypassing all of the established power channels of communication. Well, kings communicate this way and to these people and through these means. There isn't another way. And then God's like, whatever, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to talk to Joseph. How am I going to do that? I'll go to him in a dream and talk to him. So it's like this whole bypassing all the empire authority structures in a dream to a man who just happens to be the rightful king because he's from the line of King David. And he just happens to have this son who is now in line to be king in the line of King David. And the light of the world escapes under the cover of darkness to the place where they were first called out of under the leadership of Moses. Like the people of God are like being reborn again, returning to Egypt to come back to the promised land and restart that original plan of God. See, this plan here, we got to run because our lives are at stake. This is survival, and survival is not cowardice. When you got to survive, you got to survive. Survival is a form of resistance, both to oppressive empires and traumatic life circumstances. If you've ever been in either of those scenarios, you know that survival is key. And survival is how you keep your spirit alive when everything is coming down upon your head. Acts of resistance can look like self-care. They can look like small support communities, expressions of art, eating healthy, marching in rallies, educating yourself, going to an AA meeting, grief groups, therapy, medication. All of these are forms that you can take to keep your heart and spirit alive when life seems to be crashing down upon you. And whatever you do to survive is a form of faithful resistance to the empire powers or traumatic life circumstances that want to bring you down. And I love what Walter Brueggemann, scholar of the Old Testament, said: hope is born in the refusal to accept the reading of reality imposed by the powerful. This is what Matthew's doing here. Like no other historian captures this moment. And it's like Matthew is saying, I'm not going to let them tell my story. I'm not going to let them shape the story and the narrative. I'm going to tell it how it was. I'm going to tell it how I saw it and how it was. And I'm going to let you know who Herod really was and who this Jesus person is in light of that. That's how the whole thing opens up. And so obviously there's retaliations that happen. This next portion here, when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all of the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the Magi. Then what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing, a loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. She refuses to be consoled because they are no more. Now, this passage here is like rough, man. Like Herod is just ruthless. He is absolutely ruthless in his desire and pursuit of power that he would do this thing. Now, here's an actual picture of the area of Bethlehem, right outside Bethlehem, called Ramah. This is a town right outside there. This is a town mentioned here in this passage that's got a lot of history to it. There's a whole lot of history to it. This passage that he quotes here is from Jeremiah, and he's quoting this passage in the midst of a traumatic part of their story. Jeremiah is writing this from the city of Ramah, writing this and kind of recording what he sees and hears and feels. Because you remember in 586, the Babylonian armies invaded, conquered, and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. And they killed 90% of the people. 90% of the people were killed. And then they left the poorest of the poor to live off the land without any infrastructure whatsoever. And then they took the most educated, strong, and skilled men away to use as slaves in their empire. And they hauled them off. This is the story of Daniel. If you've ever read the story of Daniel in the lion's den and all that kind of stuff. That's the story of Daniel. He was one of the most educated, strong, skilled men who was stolen away to Babylon. Now they took these men here as captives to a town called Ramah for deportation to Babylon. And so you can imagine that first night. You have been deported out of your city and placed into this town Ramah, which is being used as a staging point to get you all the way to Babylon. 90% of the people have been killed. The poorest of the poor were just kind of left destitute there. And you can imagine he's hearing crying. He's hearing wailing. People have lost loved ones. Families are torn apart. If there was any family surviving, then maybe one was taken and one was left. You know, like there's just utter trauma has happened here. And there's all this weeping. There's all this crying. There's all this lamentation happening. And the prophet Jeremiah was one of these people who was one of the most educated, skilled, strong men. And he was deported to Ramah. And so there he is. And he's using these poetic words to capture the emotion of the city, full of those ready to be deported, families torn apart, families, members murdered. Now, Rachel is considered the mother of the people of God because she was the wife of Jacob in Genesis, who was renamed Israel. And so it's like all of their children become like, it's like all the ancestor, all the way back to the book of Genesis. And so here she's considered the mother of the people of God. And now her children, even though she's an ancestral mother, she's weeping for those who were killed and deported and enslaved, being their ancestral mother. And this says that she's lamenting here. Lamenting is something we're not really good at because we need to try and get over things. We need to try and just like, we don't like to look at all the sad and we don't like to look at all we just want to get back to where things were happy again. And so we never do the work to get there by lamenting and grieving and going through the process. We try with all of our might to dodge those things and just get back to where we want. But lamentation is a form of grieving that refuses to be consoled until the full truth is told about the situation that you're facing. It's like, I won't stop grieving and lamenting until every truth has been spoken about this moment. No bypassing around the hard stuff to establish an oppressive silence that says, oh, we don't talk about that. Yeah, we don't like to bring that up. It's like, no, we're going to go through the hard things to get to the other side. So this whole city of Ramah and Rachel weeping, like that's all of this history is wrapped up in that town and in this moment. And this crying in Bethlehem, he's like, it's like that one time. Feels like that. And I need to say the words because I need to say what this power structure, oppressive empire has done. And I need to call it out. I need to say the words. We need to say them. I like what James Cone said. He says, cross is God's critique of power and empire, if you want to throw that in there. Because violence is what powerful do to retain control when their power does not benefit the people anymore. That's what happens. Violence is what powerful people do to retain control. Lament is what the people do when they are crushed by the oppressive forces and circumstances. And so in this passage here, there's lamenting by the people of God, and there is violence by King Herod. And the cross, where Jesus dies on the cross, is where the empire comes crashing down upon Christ with its full force. It uses its most effective weapon, which was carefully crafted public sentiment, partnered with pain, suffering, and death, and shame. And Christ was put to death for blasphemy and treason. Those were the two accusations made by the political and religious forces of his day. And he willingly walked to the cross as if to say, I want to show you what empire power does to the pure, innocent love of God that demands justice for the people and won't be quiet. That's what the cross was. But it also was Christ saying, I also want to show you the immense power of the love of God to overcome death. And so this resurrection motif that happens when we celebrate Easter in a couple of months is not just about Jesus isn't dead anymore, yay, but it is about the victory of God over death, over the powers of the world that use death as a tool to control the people. Violence is what empires do when they're afraid. And Herod here, as powerful as Herod is, he's terrified of a baby, of a little baby. He's absolutely terrified. But tyrants die. That's what happens. Tyrants die. And in this story, Herod dies. When Herod died, that's about like, we're still in Matthew 2. And it's like, oh yeah, this whole rule of Herod that started way back then, he died. Then an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were seeking the child's life are dead. Then Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was ruling in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. After being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee, where he made his home in a town called Nazareth. Now, when Herod dies, he passes on his kingdom to his three sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. They're all Herods. And so the Herod that we see in the stories of the crucifixion is not Herod the Great, but it's Herod Antipas in one of the Herod's the Great's sons who's ruling in place. Herod Philip didn't do a whole lot. We don't hear a lot about him. And then Archelaus, don't hear much about him either. But it says that Herod dies. I think you can take the story of Matthew and sum it up in 4 words. Herod died, Jesus lives. Like, that's the whole story. That's how it begins, and that's how it ends. Herod died, and Jesus lives. It's a short summary of the Gospel of Matthew, beginning and ending. And God, again, uses dreams to communicate to Joseph, not because he's super spiritual and special, but because the text is framing the narrative in a way that says God is communicating directly with people and bypassing the oppressive empire systems that the human tyrants built. And now God is bypassing that. It's a very subversive thing that's happened. Now I want to show you a picture here. This is one of Herod's great building projects. He actually built a mountain. He took a small hill and then he built it into a mountain and then put a palace on the top. It's called the Herodium. And in 2007, an archaeologist discovered Herod the Great's tomb. We didn't know where Herod the Great was buried. We knew it was somewhere here, but we didn't know where. In 2007, they found it. And they called it the greatest discovery in the area since the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was just a massive discovery. What they found was a mausoleum inside, which was how Herod memorialized himself. So when they were looking around in his mausoleum, they said, how did Herod want to be remembered? What did he say about himself? How did he want to be seen after his death? What's the narrative that he wants told? So there's a couple of clues here. He was buried outside of Bethlehem in one of his many constructed palaces here, named after himself, the Herodium. And it was a man-made mountain with a large palace on the top. He built this to commemorate a military victory that he had there early in his career. And he made the whole mountain into a memorial to himself. And it was patterned after the greatest mausoleum in the world. They actually named mausoleums after this guy's tomb, not Herod, but the one he visited it. And he was like, this is the greatest tomb I've ever seen. And so they actually started calling them mausoleums because it was the guy who was buried in this great tomb was called Mausoleus or something like that. Can't remember off the top of my head. But they named mausoleums after him. So Herod visited that and he's like, yep, this is how I'm going. This is how I'm going to be remembered. So he actually patterned it after the greatest mausoleum in the world, which was one of the 7 wonders of the world at the time. And it was in a Greek style that other powerful rulers patterned their tombs after, like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. So he's like, yeah, those are my homeboys. Like I want to be like them. So what does this say about what he thought about himself? Here's a picture of the mausoleum that on the inside. This is what they found on there. And you can see that kind of the house looking thing. That's actually like a casket. So visually, he is connecting himself to all the great kings like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, who were divinized after their death and worshipped as gods. So after they died, they're like, yep, they're part of the pantheon now, and we worship them. And so Herod the Great is like, I'm one of the great kings too. And I should probably be divinized and worshipped as a god. Now, this mausoleum is circular. It's got 18 columns and is built after a temple of Olympia, which was dedicated to the family of Alexander the Great, a divinized king, heroic figure. So Herod is making a claim, like Alexander, I'm a dynastic ruler who is divinized. How do you think monotheistic Jews are going to handle that one? Like, I'm your king and I'm your God. It's like, no, we ain't going to play that game. Like, we don't do that. We can't do that. So instead, he has to align himself with King David and the messianic figure that was going to come from Bethlehem. So he chooses a site that is closely tied to messianic figure. And so he's saying, well, they're not going to worship me as a god, but maybe they'll adopt me as their Messiah. Maybe they'll recognize my greatness and say I'm God's given ruler to all you people because look all the great stuff I did for y'all. But he was a violent man. He's like, I fulfilled God's will. I ushered in time of prosperity. I've done all this great stuff. I must be the Messiah. And so that's how he memorialized himself. He's telling them I'm a legitimate Jewish king, even though he wasn't Jewish. And I'm a Messiah figure because look at all the stuff that I did. I'm a God-man in flesh. So Matthew here is attempting, this was probably well known at the time, what his mausoleum looked like and the story that he's telling him about himself. And Matthew's stepping in and saying, excuse me, I need to set the record straight. He's not the Messiah. He's not some God-man. He actually tried to kill the Messiah. Let me just set the record straight. That's what Matthew's doing here. I like what Oscar Romero said. God's reign is not found in power, but in fidelity, faithfulness. See, God's light does not conquer by force. It survives through faithfulness. And it is powerful, powerful force, the love of God. So I got a couple of reflection questions for you to think about this week, about this message here. Where do you see God's light on the run today? Who are today's Rachels that are weeping? What faithfulness looks small but matters deeply in your life right now? Some questions for you to think about. And here's a spiritual practice for you to try. When you get overcome by fear, place your hand on your heart, close your eyes, and try to feel the physical sensation of what fear does to your body. Where is it located? Is it in your stomach? Is it a tightness? Is it your shoulders? What is it doing? Because as soon as you get it out of your brain, out of your mind, and then you start to feel the sensation of it, it doesn't dominate you as much as it did. You might find that looking fear directly in the face will disarm it in the moment. And so this is a somatic prayer practice that you can try with your body, not just your brain, in that moment when you feel overcome by fear. Now, our benediction today is a poem that my friend Paul down in Alabama wrote, and it was in reflection to the song Silent Night, which is one of my favorite Christmas songs. And so it's a reflection on the birth of Christ, Silent Night, that whole thing. And so I'd like to read you my friend Paul's poem. They call it a silent night and sing it slow until it feels harmless. But that night didn't hush, it labored, animals shifting weight, breath turning ragged, a woman pulling life through pain with no room to be gentle, men outside pretending they weren't scared, the world breathing hard. The song skips over the waiting, the ache, the moments where nothing promises to hold. That child entered the world without a sermon, without credentials, without proof, just presence, just need, just the stubborn act of showing up exactly as he was. That's the part worth remembering. Because silence does the same to us. It strips off the borrowed voices, the titles, the noise we use to stay impressive. Silence leaves you with what's breathing underneath. You sit in your own quiet now and it hits the same. The noise is gone. The world stopped holding its breath. And all that's left is what was always there. Silence is never peace. Silence is what shows you yourself stripped of pretense. No sermon, no audience, no stage. Silence is the house after midnight when the day finally turns loose of you. The dish is still dirty, the plan's still broken, no one grading effort, no one coming to tell you what it all means. That night in Bethlehem wasn't sacred because God showed up. It was sacred because nothing hid him. No stage, no polish, no escape. Silence teaches that kind of arrival, not becoming better, becoming real. It presses you down into your own skin until pretending feels heavier than telling the truth. Until you stop asking who you should be and start listening to who's still there after everything else has gone quiet. The song hums about peace, but peace ain't the lesson. The lesson is staying put when the dark doesn't lift and the answers don't come. Staying with the ache, staying with the body you're in, staying with the life you've been given without dressing it up. That's where something honest is born. Not belief, not religion, a self that didn't need the noise to exist. That's the night we're singing about. That was called When Nothing Hid by P.A. Jones.